I would now like to take the time to thank our partner, Emerging Minds. The Emerging Minds National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health is a workforce development initiative funded by the Australian Government Department of Health under the National Support for Child and Youth Mental Health Program. The project is led by Emerging Minds and delivered in partnership with the Australian Institute of Family Studies, the Australian National University's RACGP and the Parenting Research Centre. The project focuses on building workforce capacity to better support children and parents, carers, and improve the mental health outcomes of children aged 0 to 12 years. Throughout this presentation, reference will be made to the Emerging Minds case study video that you have received the link to in the email which provided you the login details for this webinar. If you're unable to view the video, you can read the case study, which can be found under the Handouts tab in your control panel. Now to introduce our presenters. Dr. Nick Kawalenko began his postgraduate training in the Family Medicine program with RACGP before training in child psychiatry. He is Vice President of the International Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Allied Professionals. In his roles as Deputy Chair of Emerging Minds, Chair of Trazillion Council in New South Wales as a consultant to a variety of state and national NGOs and government bodies, he champions the promotion of children's mental health. Dr. James Best is a GP based on the New South Wales South Coast and has a specific interest in paediatrics, particularly paediatric disability, and is the chair of the RACGP Specific Interest Child and Young Person Health Network. Stuart and Anne Weston have over 20 years lived experience caring for family members with mental health issues. As well as his association with Emerging Minds, Stuart has worked for COPMI as a member of the National Family Forum and for Wellways Australia as a care facilitator. Anne has facilitated courses and workshops for Wellways and has worked with FAPMI for a number of years, sharing her lived experience. I will now hand over to our facilitator for this evening, Dr. James Best.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming along tonight. We've got some learning outcomes, of course, that we're going to try and address these. So engage in conversations with parents about their children's social and emotional well-being to improve the mental health outcomes for infants and children. We're going to try and help you apply the micro skills that are required to approach conversations about parent and family circumstances and children's social and emotional well-being. And we're going to try and help you identify immediate safety risks to infants and children and mitigate these risks when working with children, parents, and other professionals. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker is Nick.
Hello, thank you very much, James, and hello, everyone. I guess we're all here because we're not out celebrating Valentine's Day, so welcome to you all. So if I can just take you to this slide. Oh, my presentation really depends on you having seen the 4-minute video, because I'm going to be focusing and starting off talking about the micro skills that relate to that aspect of the aims we're trying to achieve tonight in terms of your learning. So I'll start off from that start about the video, and we want to focus on conversations in a sense about family life, and today look at what are the sort of approaches that can build resilience of children in the context of their parents dealing with difficult issues, stresses, some disability, possibly mental illness, and chronic pain. So sometimes we start these conversations off in a more general sense just to get them going, and as GPs we might want to acknowledge that all parents really want to be the very best parents they can be, but sometimes things can get in the way and they can affect family life, and of course it can affect children's well-being and relationships. And in the case that we've been looking at with Billy, he's already, the GP that's there in the videos asked that direct question already. How do you enjoy each other as a family now? And he replies a bit about, oh, we kind of just get through it. So that's Billy's perspective. That screen you might remember from the video. And really, Billy starts off talking about himself. I'm grumpy, I don't like it. He's reflecting on himself. He talks about how impressionable his 11-year-old girl Evie is, And we could, for example, the one option say, I guess that's concern to you because you are a protective father. So it's a way of really saying to the dad he's really thinking about her welfare as a way of encouraging him to speak more about her. And he's also told us that Raylene isn't there as much, his wife, and we really don't know much about the impact of that. We'll come back to that a bit as we ask about some of the other approaches that the GP has taken in the video. But what Billy does raise is his concern about Candace and Evie, but also lets us know that Evie retreats in her own room, she shuts the door, she screams at him, what a horrible life, because of how his pain limits his capacity to take her places, drive her around. She backchats me much more. At other times, she'll just leave me alone. So some of these questions are beginning to focus on emotions and the behaviour and the communication within the family. And then if we want to shift the focus a bit to asking parents, in this case Billy, about his child's well-being, her development and her relationships, we can do this with a kind of preamble that starts like this. Look, the other side of the coin, Billy, is that children are responding all the time to changes in parents' lives as well. And they do that differently, depending on their development, their strengths, and of course their relationships. So Billy, what do you see as Evie's biggest strengths? What have been the biggest changes for Evie as things have changed for you? And how much would Evie agree with this, with your views? When you put yourself in Evie's shoes, what do you think she'd say? And Billy, as you notice that Evie responds to some of these changes, how's it affecting her other relationships? Of course, relationships change with development. How would you like to see your relationship with Evie change? Billy, you're concerned about your relationship with Candace. Could you and Raylene agree on what to do about your concern? So that's a question about tapping into the strengths and capacity that the two parents might have. We don't know if Billy's discussed this with Raylene. We don't know what Raylene's views are, but we know that parents working together are more effective than one parent trying to address some issues that are of concern about their kid. So in the GP education program that will let you know a little bit about that Emerging Minds has developed, these are the kind of questions that help flesh out and explore the impact of adversity on Evie in the relationship with Billy. So in family life, as we were saying, family life is always changing and parents are always responding to things that are going on in their lives, to things that are going on in their children's lives, to things that are going in grandparents, aunts, uncles, neighbours' lives. So a nice question to remind people, and Billy has a family where he's really clear about how they've enjoyed each other's company in the past prior to his accident. How's your family stayed so strong, Billy? What have you noticed has been the biggest changes with your pain and its impact? How's all that affected Evie? How's it affected your parenting? How's it affected Raylene? We've got some clues about that. And has there been any impact of these changes on others in the wider or extended family? Has it impacted on your social activities? Have other activities for you changed and for the family? And this is one of the key spheres about looking at the impact on routines and support networks. And they're the kind of example questions there. And for the parents of you and thinking about parenting Evie, we could say in a conversational way, look, changing parenting roles is always happening with changing circumstances, and parents adapt according to their values and their culture. And that's often an opening to hear a bit more about the impact of the values of the parents, the impact of their culture, particularly obviously in the multicultural settings that so many of us work in. So what are your hopes and wishes for your parenting of Evie? How's your injury, your accident changed things for you two in parenting Evie? What's it been like for you making changes, Billy? What do you think it's been like for Raylene? You're asking Billy about his views. And how are you settling into those changes? Are they working for you? How's it changed how you two organise, supervise, plan, discipline, play, spend time with Evie? Billy, you talk about putting up with Evie and enjoying parenting. How's the balance going between the sense of putting up with Evie and enjoying parenting? Can you see that balance changing in the future? Would helping Evie make sense of what's happening for you assist her? What do you think? So these again are questions focusing on communication within the family and asking a little about routines and how the parents are taking charge of planning them and organising them. You're all GPs, and when we hear about Billy's story, Billy's telling us about the fact that he's withdrawing, and partly we're thinking as we're, the wider importance of looking after Billy and caring for him as a patient. Is this his adjustment? Because we don't know much about whether his accident and his pain is long-term, short-term, how persistent it's been. Is it more like Billy's getting a bit demoralised because things aren't turning out how he had hoped or expected? And of course, if that's persistent, he might be at some risk of depression. So these are some of the questions we're sort of thinking in the background, and they're really critical, and I'll come to that reason why in a minute. How does the withdrawal that Billy had? Billy, your withdrawal, how does it affect relationships in the family, with key members of the family, like Evie and Raylene, with friends? And what about the pattern of how your recovery's going? And with respect to friends, are you kind of maintaining friendships, backing away from them? And you're starting to ask and look at the steps that Billy might take, asking him about what he does to restore the couple's resources to cope and adapt with the challenges of parenting while the parents are under stress, particularly Billy. And you're asking about these things with a window of tolerance, because you have to tread carefully in a sense. That's why a conversational method helps so much, because a conversational approach lets Billy work through the kind of window of what he can tolerate, because he could be vulnerable to thinking about these things and in a sense avoiding them. But in the video you'll see he's pretty forthright, really. From a GP's point of view and from Evie's point of view, the best thing is Billy's timely recovery. So that's where the importance of health and well-being is really critical, I think, and the holistic approach that GPs can bring to situations such as this. The GP's given a nice preamble about Evie and how the pattern of her dependence or apparent dependence on Candace is not typical of what he sees. He's answered that question very well. But for Billy, you are concerned about Evie, and you're concerned about Evie in relationship to those sorts of activities and those sorts of people. Billy, if you remain in pain, which of these will best continue to support her development? Which of these relationships will best support her development, her further relationships, and her well-being? Could you plan for this? How? What do you think would best protect her, keep her strong, keep her on track? And you mentioned that Evie doesn't complain. She's a good kid. What helps her keep this up, but is not complaining tough on her? So there's this balance of appreciating the impact of his pain and withdrawal, and sometimes grumpiness on Evie. And that question, the GP asked that question very well, and you saw that happen in the video, the last question there. In terms of the work that Emerging Minds has been engaging in this webinar, it really is about the conversation and tapping into the strengths available in parents, their broader networks. The GP's given Billy some resources, and the aim here is to support GPs to identify and describe how parental adversity can impact on children, and focuses on the conversations to support children's resilience by expanding the capacity of parents to respond to children's needs. And it introduces the PERCS conversation guide, which I'll show you in a minute, and has some nice resources around that and some sample questions. And Emerging Minds also has some other online educational resources which offer a suite of more intensive interventions along these lines that kind of step up the potential for more intense interventions. And there are two programs there, one called Let's Talk, which is the simpler one, about 3 or 4 hours online education program, and Family Talk, a bit more involved, probably more consistent with those GPs involved in practicing those focused psychological strategies. And you can see the link there to some of the training options online. So if we look at this one that's for GPs, the PERCS conversation guide, have a look at slide 2. PERCS derived from the 5 domains, asking about parent-child relationships, exploring emotions and behaviours, examining routines for the child in question, like Evie, the communication networks and how that occurs, and I focused on some questions in the couple, particularly to elucidate that, but also communication with Evie, and what are the overall support networks for the child. So there are some sample questions in the first 8 or 9 slides that I presented tonight, and there's plenty more actually within the education program, the online education program. And slide 1 just shows you that part of the approach here is for GPs to recognise and use common everyday entry points, or what we call the opportunities, to engage with parents about parent-patient, their parents who are patients in conversations about their children. So you can see the examples there. Parent expresses concern, like Billy has about Evie, or parent presents with an issue of circumstance that might impact on the child, like chronic pain or acute pain, and the GP opens up the conversation to explore the child's social and emotional well-being through we've mainly focused on questions that are open inquiry, and also that kind of whole ecology of concerns around parental, family, or social adversity. And then as a kind of overview, the conversation with a parent it really depends on those 6 principles. I think James might to mention them to you in a bit more detail. And the aim is to look at providing support to parents with the aim to build resilience by buffering the child from the impacts of adversity, to intervene in the child's social and emotional well-being in a supportive way, and really in a parent-led way to foster a more positive parent-child relationship, to look at linking the parent to community supports or services if that seems a useful link for them, or that they have some experience of those, and then to schedule a follow-up on the supports with the parent. And this example of Billy follows providing some psychoeducational resources. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions, and James will follow on from that.
Thanks very much, Nick. Yeah, so if you want to, if you do have any questions for Nick, we're going to have a question session, hopefully, at the end, where we can respond to some of your written questions or maybe just chat about them. So I'm just now going to talk about my bit. So as was mentioned, I'm the chairman of the Child and Young Person Health Network, which is a network within the College of GPs that many of you might not know about. And it's if you're a member of the college, it's actually free to join, and I encourage you all to join. And we're going to be sending out regular newsletters on all child-related health matters. But tonight, basically what I would like to cover is, I'm just going to talk about PEDS in general practice, firstly, as an overall thing. And then I'm going to talk about some of the issues I like to talk to parents about, some of the structures I use in my consulting. And I'm also going to mention a study that's been done recently with parents in Victoria. And then I'm going to talk about a thing called ACEs, which I suspect not too many of you know about, but some of you may. So we'll just start out with pediatrics in general practice. Obviously, we all see kids, you know, or nearly all of us. The Beach data used to be about 15% of GP consults were pediatric. That's the latest data, though, is, which is still a few years ago, is about 11% now. So it's dropped down a bit, but it's still a very important part of what we do. And I think it's also something that we want to protect, in that we want to maintain that we are the primary person to see kids. And I think if we continue to do our job well, then that should continue to happen. Of course, PEDS is a very broad area. We're talking about infants, toddlers, early childhood, preteens, and teens. You know, they all present very differently. So, you know, let's talk about infants first. Infants and their parents, what sort of things come up in our setting? I mean, often we're talking to parents about crying, mothers in particular, and this word colic, which is becoming a bit more of a controversial word, and I'll explain why in a sec. We often talk about sleep, and you know, we may or may not have the skills to really adequately talk about some of these issues. We might be referring on to family support people such as Tresillian, Caratani, and such. We're thinking about postnatal depression, which is so common, of course, and we're doing those Edinburgh screens. And we're talking about, I think it's really important to think about, even if it's through what you observe and what you ask, about bonding, about attachment. You know, how is this mother-child or carer-child dyad going? So they're the sort of things we talk about in infancy. I mentioned about colic and crying. Many of you, I think, would be familiar with PURPLE, the period of purple crying, which is I've got a great website. If you're not familiar with it, you can just Google period of purple crying. And it's an acronym, of course, about what are the characteristics of what is referred to as normal infant crying. I think that's a preferable term, normal infant crying, to colic, which suggests there's something wrong with the gut. And I think that can actually be quite liberating for parents when you do discuss that. We can then talk about toddlers and young children. You know, tantrums and behaviour. It's a very common discussion point with that we see in our rooms. What is a tantrum? What is an abnormal amount of tantruming and poor behaviour? Is it got to do with the parent's perception rather than what the child is actually doing? So it's a two-faceted phenomenon. What is actually happening and what is being perceived? And also we've got to think a bit more broadly of this. You know, in your 2-year-old who is just tantrum after tantrum and having major behavioural problems, is it ASD? Do we have to start asking those screening questions about social development and communication development? In an older child, in a 6 or 7-year-old, where behaviours at school and attention and acting out, is it maybe an ADHD type issue as well? So we have to think of sometimes a bit more broadly as well. So, you know, toddlers and young children can be really stressful. I mean, if you're faced with something like this on a frequent basis, that can be very demoralizing. And of course, you know, if the parents become demoralized, what effect does that have on the child? Then we can talk about pre-teens and teens. You know, things like bullying, things like the increasing rates of mood disorders, of anxiety and depression in young people. There are lots of tricky issues with all this sort of stuff. You know, when is it okay to use an SSRI? Do we have access to services like Headspace, or can we use better outcomes? What are the confidentiality rules? You know, for a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old? What are we not allowed to do? We need to be familiar with that legislation, and it does vary from state to state. Many of you will be familiar with HEADS, of course, the HEADS structure on the left-hand side there for adolescents. And it's a beautiful way of, and you don't have to do the whole HEADS all in one consult. It can be rolled out over several consults, but it structures it nicely for the less threatening things at the top and the more challenging things to discuss at the bottom. It's a really nice structure, I think, HEADS. Many of you will be familiar with that. I've sort of adapted HEADS a little bit on the right here for early childhood, because I think you can. I mean, the home's still relevant. The eating and obviously growth in small children is still important. Activities are still important. Are they being provided adequately? Things like, do they have the appropriate motor activities and communication activities, such as reading? Are they getting opportunities to play, particularly imaginative play? Then we get into the more on the teenage stuff with the drug, sexuality, suicide, safety. I think it does start differing then in terms of early childhood, where we're talking about development and we're talking about sleep and we're talking about secure attachment and parenting. And safety still applies. You know, young children and safety is very important, both in the home and outside the home. But what about the parents? It all comes back to the parents. And I think when we're dealing with young children who have maybe behavioural issues, maybe developmental issues, it often has got so much to do with how the parents are going as well. And part of that can be to do with parental schema. Now, parental schema, some of you may be aware about, it's basically what you've got inside your head. You know, what are the shortcuts of thought processes that you use when you think about parenting issues? And that has often got to do with how they've been brought up themselves. What are their attitudes to discipline? If there are two parents or two carers, do they match up? So, you know, often parents don't find out about these things until they have a kid. And that can cause, of course, problems in the relationship between the parents if they do have mismatching parenting styles. What are their cultural beliefs about parenting? And if there's two cultures in the house, how do they fit together? So there's all sorts of schema issues when it comes to parenting. Something I really do like to talk to parents about is the concept of child temperament, which many parents are unfamiliar with. First developed in the 1970s, Thomas and Chess were the first researchers to properly get hold of this area, and they developed a structure of talking about temperament as being 15% of children having an easy temperament, 15% having a difficult temperament, and 70% having kind of a mix, and what they refer to as slow to settle. Now, easy and difficult, I find slightly difficult terminology actually, because if you have a child with a difficult temperament and you didn't understand that children can just simply be born with a bunch of DNA that determines their temperament, you can realize then that if you have this child with a difficult temperament, that it's not your fault. And that can be really liberating for parents. So what are easy and what are difficult characteristics? Well, I've made a little table here. It's actually also in Murtagh, by the way, if you want to reference it later, in the later editions of Murtagh. And on the left-hand side, the easy temperament characteristics, we all want a kid like this. And on the right-hand side is the difficult temperament characteristics. Now, easy doesn't equal bad. Easy doesn't equal good, and difficult doesn't equal bad. That's really important to say to parents of children with difficult temperaments, because we need people with difficult temperaments. Society needs them. They became great barristers or sports people, or in the old days, they were the people who chucked spears in the battle. You know, their society needs a mixture of people, and that's why some children have those, are dominated by some of those sort of characteristics. I also like to talk about consequences, and parents will usually use the word punishment rather than consequences, and or discipline rather than discipline. Discipline's a good word. Punishment not so good. What we're trying to get with consequences, and these are the three types of consequences that actually are useful. The best one's a natural one, where the unwanted behaviour by the child leads to the unwanted outcome for that child without the parent being involved. So if you don't have your dinner, you're hungry. If you don't wear your jumper, you're cold. If you break your toy, you've got a broken toy. And the parent does not need to get involved. And telling parents to just really back off, let them learn from the world. Related or logical consequences are similar, but not quite as good, where the parent has to be a little bit involved for the unwanted outcome to occur. So for example, if you don't have your dinner, you can't have your ice cream. Now that requires the parent to withhold the ice cream. And so the child, particularly a child with a difficult temperament, may turn around and say, you know, rather than getting the message, I should have eaten my dinner, they may have the thought, oh, mum's being mean. So the mother needs to, or whoever is the parent or carer, needs to keep themselves as small as possible and unemotional as possible. The third consequence that can be useful is what's called withdrawal of privilege, where you're taking something away as a consequence of the behaviour. Now, it's often done by parents, but unfortunately often done not so well. It really needs to be known by both parties that misdemeanour equals that withdrawal privilege before, and to be agreed upon. As Turek and Wernick say down the bottom there, a child should not be punished unless the expectation, rule and consequence are clearly articulated ahead of time. So they're the things that work. Let's talk about the things that don't work. Constantly explaining, repeatedly warning, threatening, pleading, arguing, bribing, giving in, and of course smacking. Now, when I show parents this list, they usually look at it with a wry smile, and before they say anything, I say, yes, we all do these at some stage, or not all of them, but we all do a lot of them, and maybe not that, hopefully not too many doing the smacking, but they're the things that basically undermine the child-parent relationship. So they're the things that really aren't contributing in a positive way, but you shouldn't beat yourself up if you've actually done them. Smacking, though, is a bit of a different issue. Now, these are some of the comments that people will say about smacking. When I was smacked, strapped, grounded, put in a broom closet, it never did me any harm. When my father strapped me, I took notice. But really, that's not the point. What are people talk about is smacking child abuse, and like I'm talking about normal smackings, open hand, not head and neck, occasional. That's not going to traumatize terribly most children. And so to start calling every slap a child abuse, I think is a bit silly, really. Yet we still have these really high rates of thinking that sort of smacking is okay. 70% in this particular study noted in the media. Why isn't it a good idea? Well, there's basically three reasons. First of all, when you smack a kid, you're showing that child a lack of respect, which is really part of what we're after. We're trying to build self-esteem. And the way we're going to do that is not by having to beat them for them to control themselves. And we're also trying to build resilience. And this is something that needs to be nurtured by them feeling good about themselves and confident, not bludgeoned into them. And of course, it's sending the wrong message that violence equals solution. So this comes back, all this sort of stuff really is talking about parenting styles. And some of you may be familiar with this very well-worn sort of quadrant of parenting styles, where we're all after the authoritative sort of style. Where it often goes wrong is with authoritarian style, which is because I said so, and you're not involved in this decision making. I'm telling you what to do. Permissive also you see a bit of, which is whatever. You're the boss. You're in charge. I'll do whatever you want. And uninvolved, of course, which is basically where you're neglecting emotionally the child. Really, what we're after is the authoritative style, where we're combining that guidance. Kids need to know what's right and wrong. We need to teach them that. We need to direct them in that direction, but we need to do so in a warm, loving tone. Some people have criticised this structure as being a little bit US-centric or a little bit Western-centric, that it doesn't take some of the cultural issues into consideration, and that may have some validity. But really, I think telling parents to try and guide their children in a warm, loving way, I don't think is really going to be too problematic. Back to smacking, it actually has been shown by the American Academy of Pediatrics to be linked to mental illness. There's actually quite a lot of good quality evidence to show that that actually does happen. So, you know, it's not a small thing. Now, this study that was done recently in Victoria is quite a large study, 2,600 Victorian parents. In 2017 it was. And it had a lot of dads, about 40% were fathers, which is great. It basically asked them, you know, where they get help and how supported do they feel. And over 90% of them felt that they had someone they could trust and to turn to for advice, which is a pretty good figure. Only 3% didn't know where to go if they needed help with their children. And about 80% of them, interestingly, were pretty satisfied with the help they received from professionals, such as us, GPs, and also teachers, educators. I suppose that includes preschool teachers as well. But also about 80% use the internet for parenting, which may be good or may be bad, depending on where they go on the internet, of course. And the study looked at how did the parents view their own behaviour? Over 40% of them felt that they wish they didn't become impatient with their children so quickly, and nearly 30% said that they were too critical of their children. So, you know, sizable numbers were self-reflecting that they had issues about how they interact with their children. Once again, nearly a third reported that they smacked, and 2% reported that they smacked quite a lot or very much. And about a third said that once again sleep was a problem, particularly in the younger kids. But interestingly, when you look into the 140-page report, which I did, and on page 73, I found this graph, and about half of you'll see there about half of GPs half of parents use GPs as a source, and that figure gets even higher when you're talking about kids with medical or learning disabilities. And if you look further down that page, you'll see about 80% of them were satisfied or very satisfied with the help, the support that they were getting. So, you know, we're doing pretty well there, I think. And once again, about 90% were thinking that they were satisfied with the help that they got from their GP. About 88% didn't feel judged, and 95% didn't feel blamed. So I think we are communicating with parents well, and we're hopefully mostly doing it in the right sort of tone. Where else do parents get support? Other people, like relatives and friends, of course. They found online, about 80%, as I said before. About 2/3 said that they got support from play groups and early childhood centres, and about a fifth said that they did parenting courses like Triple P, 1, 2, 3 Magic, or Small Talk, which is always something I suggest is a good idea for parents to do. But the researchers did doubt some of those latter figures because they thought the respondents may have been giving socially desirable answers. Now I'd like to introduce you to ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. This is a concept that was developed by the Center for Disease Control in the US in a large 17,000 people 1998 study. And there's been about 70 or more follow-up studies, and it's now being referred to as a movement, where basically all of this large amount of quality research has shown a stunning link between trauma, and I think we could all predict that it could lead to mental and behavioural issues, emotional issues, but also chronic disease, both physical and mental. It's been linked with poor social outcomes, poor emotional problems, increase in suicide rates, even increase in early death and outside of suicide. So it's phenomenally important. In these studies, generally about 2/3 of people surveyed have at least one of them. And of those 2/3, nearly 90% had 2 or more. And we also know that about more than 4 have got a very high odds of bad outcomes. So what are they? If I can move my slide.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Hang on. There we go. What are the experiences? So they're there, and you know, they're the usual suspects. There's no great surprises there. We kind of all know this, but I think to have it really clearly distilled into this list, that really these are the things that should, as GPs, should be going red flag, we need to watch these people as they're at high risk of having, of having significant problems. If you, there we go. If we just some more data on that, just you see the graph just going up. The more of those 10 things you have in your life, the worse the outcomes become, and really broad outcomes with lots of different issues. So this, of course, though, does not mean it's a destiny of darkness. There is things that can be done, that resilience can be there. Humans are incredibly resilient creatures, including children. And despite some pretty horrific circumstances, sometimes you can come back. But they need help. They need things like parenting training programs, intimate partner violence prevention, social supports, high quality childhood care. All these sort of things are the things that can get you out of this high risk group. Now, Nick did mention about the perks domains, the emerging minds have got together. It's really good structure, I think, to just, and these example questions I think are really good too, to say, how are you going, how are you going being a parent to little Johnny, just asking things about, like, do you feel safe in your own home, how do you play with, do you get time to play with your kid, these sort of just general sort of questions about that lead to these sort of domains. And we mentioned about the courses online as well, which sound terrific. I haven't done them yet. I intend to, and I hope that a lot of you guys do as well. And Nick also mentioned about this sort of structure about the entry point. And I think that's really critical in general practice, that if you actually make the effort to say, how are you going? Or how's your family going? How's your child going? In general, how's school? These are really good opening questions that lead you into their life, and if there is an issue, that hopefully will bring it out into the open. Then we talked about those perks domains, and these 6 principles in the orange there. I think they're great. My favourite is curiosity, and closely followed by respect. I think being curious about the patient in front of you is just such a good GP thing to do, and respectful. And I think all of those are good, but they're my favourites. And I think basically you're just trying to, as it says at the bottom, arrive at a shared understanding and a shared decision about what we're going to manage, how we're going to manage this situation. And then, of course, going on to providing support. So you might want to think about doing those courses online to get some really good education in those areas about how to do that. Further online stuff, of course, Raising Children Network, and I think all of you would probably know about the Raising Children Network. It's an amazingly well-resourced website, and it's got some really good quality stuff. It's constantly reviewed and researched, and it's got links everywhere. I use it at least a couple of times a day and talking about things, and you just know it's quality. And so I think, obviously that's a really good thing online. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing my slide. There we go. Oh. And dealing with parents, is difficult. It's intense. Parenting is the most important thing you do in your life. And so, people really want to do it right. So understanding that schema behind where the parent is coming from, how they may have been raised may be influencing their decision. It's almost a bit like motivational interviewing, that I want to see where you are, and in terms of how you're interacting with your kids, and where I can take you from there. I've got this saying, win the child, win the mother. Getting down on the floor with the kid and interacting with the kid, especially, I must say, disabled kids, because they don't get so much of it. You do that, you will win whoever's looking after that kid. And so I think that's just a useful thing to say. And as I said, chronic disability and chronic disease, it's even more intense. The emotions are more. When you've got a kid, the thing you want to do is to protect them. When you've got a kid with disability or chronic disease, you want to protect them more. And but as the GP, you remain the guide. You need to keep a broad view, maintain that family doctor sort of role, and to be honest with them. And that comes down to that respect and curiosity, and to watch for those wobbles. These are just some resources I use there on the screen, and some particularly, there you'll see a couple of books related to autism and to ADD that I like. Also, just to mention that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander a division of the college have a national guide to a preventive health assessment. So just mentioning that as part of this sort of topic. And also that there is currently Emerging Minds have a opportunity for research involvement. Many of you, received an email saying you can get $200 for a 90-minute interview and to help them out. So if you want to do that, I think it'd be a good thing to do. Just go to that link there, or just go onto the Emerging Minds website. I'm sure it'll be there somewhere. Now we're going to hand over to Anne and Stuart, who are going to talk about preventing mental health issues for institute children from a family partner's perspective.
I just want to acknowledge the audience of practitioners. It's absolutely rare that myself and Anne get to speak to an audience such as this with so many doctors and so many GPs, and it's a credit that you guys have given up your time, guys and girls have given up your time to be here on this wonderful Valentine's Day. I actually brought my wife up here to Sydney on Valentine's Day. Did you guys do that? But I think it's really impressive to us to know that there's people out there in the field that you guys are in that are prepared to spend that extra bit of time and do that for us, and we really appreciate that very much. Our first slide, I don't know what I've done there, I've mucked something up, there you go, is building a rapport with the patient. Now, we take that as being really, really important to us as parents, and in general, just building up that rapport with the GP. And we saw all the facts that come up there before of how parents trust GPs and trust their doctors and are so pleased about where things are going. And I must admit, look, we are too. And look, I could say there's been negatives, and there has been negatives, but not a lot, thank God. And it's a credit to GPs to take the interest and show the interest that want to make a difference and help us. We go in there as parents being quite vulnerable, and we do that because we love our children. Like you guys there that are parents as well, you know how that feels with your children, and they're the most important things in your lives. And when you go in there and there's something wrong with you or something wrong with them, you're vulnerable. You're very vulnerable. If you've been waiting, or if the kids are being misbehaving, or whatever the case may be, you're really in a position where you're at wit's end. And to have a GP be calm and collective and talking to you and really taking that interest in where you're at is such a smoothing and comforting place to be, and it really makes a big difference. That's how we as parents feel that we've been valued, and that our position in being able to go to a doctor really makes a big difference to us. Sometimes it can be really hard. You've got things in your life that are really struggling with, and it's very, very hard sometimes to go in there and open up, particularly about your children and particularly about your families, because the first thing that we tend to do is we blame ourselves. And for anything that's going wrong with our kids, the first people we blame ourselves because of what's gone wrong. To have that rapport with the GP that can open that up and to be able to investigate what's going on, and we saw some terrific examples of how to do that before, it makes such a big difference to know that we're in there with somebody who cares and somebody that really wants to make a difference in our lives and help our children out is really, really important. This also gives the parents the opportunity to mention their kids. If they feel comfortable with the GP they're talking to, they'll bring those subjects up. They'll say, look, things haven't been great at home, but so and so has been having these issues, and I don't know why. I don't know why they're acting the way they're acting. And by just asking some simple questions, you might find out that the answers might lie with us ourselves, that we're going through some difficult times ourselves, and our children feed off that. And they do from all ages, from young toddlers right through to teenagers, right through to young adults. They feed off how we feel. We have a disabled daughter at home with Down syndrome who she's 25 now, but she feels every emotion that we have, and she struggles with that, and we struggle to know how to get her through that. And to be able to talk to somebody on a level playing field and sort of, can you help us because we don't know what to do, makes a big, big difference to us. It's really, those sort of things are really important, that we're able to be able to do that. Taking interest in the whole family, and that's what sort of that leads on to, is asking questions about the children's well-being. And that, as I said before, can become a bit difficult sometimes of how you do that. But be non-judgmental, because, and look, most times doctors they are judgmental with people. And trust me, not everybody that goes in to see a GP is behaving themselves, and they're rowdy, and they're not the clean, good-looking people that go in there with their lovely family that are all behaving themselves, and they behave the same way. I've seen them myself go in to see doctors, and they're arrogant. They're either high on drugs, or they've been drinking too much, or whatever the case may be, and they're rude, they're arrogant, and that comes across as, geez, how do you talk to people like this? Even though they've still got the same sort of problems, they've got 2 kids at home that are in a vulnerable position because dad's behaving like this or mum's behaving like this, and they've got issues themselves. And I think being able to have that respect towards them and be non-judgmental towards where they're going through can make a real difference to them. And just, it can be hard, it can be difficult, it can be, geez, what do I say without, getting me head knocked off by some of these people, but just taking that time to show that you're interested. Just let them know, geez, maybe little things like, geez, I can see by just what you've explained to me, you've got an awful lot on your plate, and geez, the fact that you're still here today and still being able to come in here to me, that's a credit to you. And I think sometimes just hearing a little bit of praise, whether it's deserved praise or not deserved praise, I think that sort of changes the attitude towards that person. And they think, geez, okay, geez, yeah, you're right. It has been tough for me, but yeah, I'm still here and I'm still battling and I'm still having to go. And yeah, okay, maybe I am being a bit rude and maybe I am not behaving the way I should be behaving. So they then turn that as, oh, that's a positive for me, and I can act a little bit differently. And that starts to build that rapport between themselves and the doctor. Asking those questions first off can be quite difficult. So ask them questions that they can give answers to. So, ask them the open questions that they're willing to give a proper answer to, not just a yes or a no. How's Billy going home? Yeah, fine. Ask those questions. Even if they do get a little bit on the, oh, geez, I don't want to answer that question again, and look, everything's fine, stop asking me. If you think that something's not right, generally it's not right. So your instincts are pretty good. And if you think that that's not right, just make those other inquiries. Just maybe put it a different way, Be persistent, but be respectful. And most people will generally come around to that. Having a good relationship with your doctor is probably, to us, one of the most important things in life, I reckon. It's something that, it's our first port of call when anything goes wrong. And that is a relationship that we want to make sure that just continues to blossom all the time. We want to go to these doctors and we want to be able to tell them that, we aren't travelling too well, and here's the reason. And look, I haven't been too well, but the people at home are even finding ways that they're struggling as well. It's important that they know that those things aren't really, the right way to go with that.
Setting the right atmosphere for talking to, having conversations with parents about their children and about themselves is really quite hard at times. It's important to set the right atmosphere. A lot of parents will go in and feel that they're going to be judged if they talk about their children, that the blame is going to be on them. And talking to them about how they're feeling, how they're coping, just general questions, just how's things going, sometimes opens up conversations. Finding ways to be courteous about delayed appointments, keeping parents informed that their appointments will be delayed. Sometimes just a phone call from the receptionist or someone just to say that you're going to be late, that the appointment is going to be late. When you've got children with you and you've got to entertain children in a waiting room, believe me, it's not much fun. And if you don't have to go in there and wait for an hour, and you can go in there and you know that you're going to be seen fairly soon, it relieves the stress, and you're open to talking rather than being angry. Making parents feel that they're not a burden, not making them feel like they're holding everybody else up. I've been in distress and had doctors say to me, well, look, I've got other patients, I really don't have time for this. So sometimes making sure that people make double appointments so that they're not rushed, they're not feeling like they're a burden, they're not holding everyone else. Don't minimise their problem by rushing. That makes it really difficult to open up if you're being rushed. I think that being looked at in the face instead of looking at a computer is really important. Sometimes doctors, I know that they've got to do their work on their computer and they've got to do notes, but eye contact is really important. To be looked at and acknowledged is so important. One day I walked in, I was in extreme crisis. The doctor turned the chair around, faced me, put their hands on my knee and asked me what the problem. I automatically felt that they really wanted to know what the problem was, what was going on in my family, what was happening, why I was feeling so distressed. Just talking to me like a friend, building up a rapport and talking to me like a friend. It makes clients feel welcome, valued, accepted and understood. Working together when referring. Encourage discussion. Help parents to be open to the idea of a referral. So avoid telling them that they need a referral. Make it a two-way conversation so that it's a discussion. You know, what do you think about this? Do you think this will help? Do you think that they might need, you might need some extra help? Do you need some help in the family? Do you need, even human services? Sometimes, you know, people think that that is going to be the last resort. Sometimes that can be helpful. It can be useful. We found that in our family that it can be useful. Take care with the tone of voice. Let's discuss this idea, not this is what I'm going to do and this is what I should do. If a parent is reluctant to follow up a referral, be willing to explore their concerns and respond with perhaps other alternatives. Don't give up. Sometimes people go in there and they don't want to open up straight away, but given the time and given the understanding, most families do want to help their children, do want to help themselves, and if you are willing to pursue it, you will get some answers and some questions from them. It's really about shared decision making, building confidence and making them feel confident to make choices in their lives rather than decisions being made for them. The right to make your own decisions in collaboration with somebody else is really important. It makes you feel that you are a good parent, you are a good person, and that you are basically doing a good job rather than a bad job. financially, that's an important point. It's important to ask. Adversity can really affect families' finances. It's good to have parents heard it and acknowledged it. Some parents are ashamed, are frightened to admit that they have bills. You know, they can't afford to pay doctor's bills. If they're not going to a bulk billing like we didn't do, we discovered that we had an enormous bill, and it wasn't until somebody asked us, why aren't you paying it, that we said, look, we don't have any money. We were too embarrassed and too ashamed to say that, you know, we didn't have any money.
The financial strain can put a lot of pressure on the whole family. It can put that relationship between the two parents really at ease, right on edge. We're sort of going through this through a little bit of experience ourselves, because we went through all this and we know exactly what that was like, particularly when our kids were young. It really hurts those relationships. It hurts those relationships with not only just the parents and their family, but also their extended family as well. It really puts pressure on them. It puts a lot of strain and a lot of pressure on their parenting skills. Worrying about money, probably the two things you worry about more than anything else in the world would be your family and money. And it's both of them go together pretty easily too. And if you haven't got any money, there's really puts a lot of strain on where that relationship's going to go. It puts strains on friendships as well. It puts strain on the fact that, okay, look, I can't go somewhere because we haven't got the money to do it. And so you lie, you just make up stories of why you're not doing this. And then you get labelled, oh, look, he's a bit of a recluse, he doesn't want to go anywhere, the kids can't do this, they're wearing second-hand uniforms. So their relationships with their friends as well is under strain as well. So having those financial burdens can be a real worry.
Families might not be aware that they're accessing all of their Centrelink payments. I know for years that we didn't know we were entitled to a healthcare card for 8 years because nobody had bothered to tell us. So being open to discuss that, it's not an embarrassing subject. It's an important subject, because if you're not getting what you're entitled to, you are risking your family's well-being and their activities, their things they can do, holidays and all those sorts of things. So it's important that you be made aware. So, you know, doctors probably need to ask that question.
And it's okay to ask those things, because the finance situation for most families is a real difficult one, but it's a good way to lead into conversations about how their kids are going, how their families are going, and how they're going in general as well. So it is a good opener. Well, I'd just like to just say that also on that, just ask financially of just where these patients are, about their circle of friends and their circle of help that they get, that they are getting enough help. If they're not getting enough help, give them the answers of where to go to for that help. Look, just on behalf of myself and Anne, I'd just once again just like to thank you all for listening to us and hearing our point of view on all this. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, guys. We're just going to we're just going to have a bit of a chat about some of the questions that have been sent in. So just having a look at some of those questions now. I think just getting close there. There was a question here from. Let's get there. Someone was asking online about sometimes only mother comes in to ask advice about how to cope stress about the relationship, stubborn denial father and challenging teenage son. If all family do not wish to be involved, should GP focus on only mother's stress? I think that question kind of reflects the complexity of family dynamics. Sometimes it is the mother that's coming in, often the mother's coming in, but sometimes it's the father. Sometimes it's mother and father. Sometimes the teenager can't be dragged in, or you know, or it's a younger child. So there's all sorts of different permutations. And I think you're trying to address all of those different relationships within that family, something that Nick, I think you were alluding to before. You know, what are the relationships that are going on in this situation, and what are the ones that are going to be protective for that individual? Yes?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. You can certainly do that questioning with mum alone about, you know, what would dad say if he was here? What would the, if I rang him, meaning if I'm the GP and often if there's a question about teenagers, I certainly have been in the practice of routinely ringing dad, because there's often his mum alone without dad. And I find that if I ring dad and say, you know, I always get consent, permission from the mum, and I say something like, you know, your partner's coming to see me today and there's a bit concerned about your teenage daughter, son, whatever. And I would find it very valuable to hear your opinion on this, because I think your input might be critical to understand what's going on. About 95% of dads will turn up. You know, everyone can make a flexible appointment or whatever. And that's always surprised me. With a direct approach, in the way that I guess Stuart was saying, you say, you're important to your kid. I need your perspective to make sense of what's going on. It's pretty rare that a dad won't come. And sometimes mums guard the gateway to dad for a variety of reasons. There may be, you know, distinct issues about why mum's guarding the gateway, which you need to understand and know about in the context potentially of family violence or whatever. So sometimes there are good reasons, and you want to explore them with mum, and that's why you might ask questions about what she thinks in the way of dad coming, etc. I don't know if Stuart or Anne want to comment on that.
I think as a rule the mother does come in. Generally sometimes fathers are working, so it's left to the mother to go in. I know that I've taken on that job most of the time, to take my children into the doctor. When things have become complicated, Stuart has come in and we've discussed it together. So that certainly has happened as well.
Of course, you know, there are all sorts of permutations of families. There's blended families, there's single parent families, there's, you know, there's same-sex families, there's, you know, so there's all sorts of issues, and so this will be a very individual thing. I
think that's a really good point. And certainly you can say to a parent, who is the person who most supports you in your parenting role? I find a lot of single mums who'll say, oh, that's my best friend so-and-so. Or they'll say someone else who might not occur to you. But it's important to know who's the person who can most assist them, because that person's an incredibly valuable resource.
Yeah, that part of it's really important. Particularly if it's a married couple and you ask them who's the most significant person that's helping you out, and they say, well, gee, it's not that really no good husband of mine. It's you know, my best friend Mabel, who, you know, we talk to every day about what's going on. That's important, I think, to know that and to be able to feed that back into the family. So there you know already that there's issues in that family. I think they're good, important questions to ask.
We're getting a few questions about mental health plans and diagnoses and Medicare stuff, I suppose, which maybe I couldn't address. There is no reason at all why a child cannot have a mental health plan done, and children are able to get mental health diagnoses. You do need to have a mental health diagnosis to do a mental health plan. You can't write behavioural problems, but you know, it's usually not too difficult to be able to legitimately apply a label that gives them access to those resources. So Peter mentioned about sleep disturbance. No, I don't think that would count, but you can have sleep disorders. I usually do not find that too much of a problem myself, but you know, I suppose it depends on your own practice. But certainly mental health plans can be done for children.
I'll just ask James about this in a second, but certainly for youth, you know, there's no special provisions around mental health plans and access. Similarly, there has been a pattern for children that in mental health plan language, that means kids 0 to 11. And there used to be a category called with or at risk of mental disorder as a pathway to talk to parents about their kid if their kid isn't present. Has that survived the changes in the movement to PhD?
I actually don't know.
No. All right. Of course, a question for the crowd, I think.
I do remember that being about too. So yeah.
The other thing, of course, is NDIS is coming into this as well, and of course NDIS is a functional assessment. It's not, you do not need any diagnosis. You just need to display a level of disability in terms of your function. There's also a question here about positive parenting, which is a good one. Sarah Metcalf has said, what about a positive parenting approach without punishment? Focus is on the connection with the child and emotional regulation of the parent, coaching rather than control. Well, yes, you're right. And positive parenting is a very good concept. It comes down to that authoritative model of warmth with guidance. They still need the guidance. They still need to know what is allowed and what is not allowed. That doesn't mean it needs punishment. Punishment, the word comes from punus, the Latin to harm. We don't want to harm our kids. We want to guide them. As distinct from discipline, which comes from the Latin discipla, which means to teach. And that's where we're aiming for. So positive parenting absolutely fits within that model.
I'll just say that James's nice model about his quadrant, with his far corner of permissive parenting, that's a group who you might want to encourage for behavioural approaches. So part of this is about, cutting the cloth, if the cap fits, wear it, cutting the cloth to fit the shape of the patient you're dealing with. And so some of this, really depends on how you assess the predominant parenting style of the parents as to which approach might best help them. And you can do some tailoring around that.
Yep. So someone's written here, please give an example of a diagnosis you use in under 5-year-olds. Well, you want to rattle some off?
Oh, yeah. So there are all those formal ones like, reactive attachment disorder, ADHD can be evident in kids under 5, ASD problems.
Absolutely.
Certainly there can be oppositional defiant disorder, and then, so they're all those they're all there in the cookbook in one sense. But we should be clearer with you about if this category, with or at risk of mental disorders, has survived. Because
I'm not sure. Sorry.
That's really the kind of category we need around the issue. Some of you raised the issue about kind of parenting counselling if the kid isn't there. That's really critical in terms, sometimes particularly, oppositional defiant disorder or kids with behavioural problems.
What about attachment disorder? Would that?
Yeah, attachment disorder is an unequivocal diagnosis. It's about trying to make it properly, because in a sense it's hard work. And then there are a lot of early childhood carers and educators who are very good about telling parents that their kids are at one end of the spectrum, or at one end of the pole in what's usual behaviours. And often that's around things like too frequent tantrums. So those kind of indicators are really critical and can come from people like early child education and care people who work with young kids, even under 3s every day. And they are quite good at detecting those kids who are, one end of the pole in terms of their behaviours or emotions.
And while this is important stuff, if especially if a family that is struggling financially, but I find it's really the most important thing is engaging with you, and as the GP, and that someone's helping them, and we're the first port of call, and that's really the most important thing is we have that curiosity. That we're interested in them as patients and their family dynamics. What you were talking about with relationships before, Nick.
Yeah, and I think that's what Stuart emphasised, that the genuine interest in the person as parent.
Yeah, look, and as I did see a question there that somebody posted before about, do we feel that older doctors were more were better at doing that, at acknowledging that and showing that empathy towards patients. Look, I don't know if that's correct or not. I think, look, there's young doctors that are terrific at it as well. I think sometimes it's just in your general makeup of how you do that. And look, I think a lot of it comes down to workload as well. Sometimes you just don't have that time to be able to give all that to do exactly what we'll discuss tonight, that of how it would be fantastic for the parents to do all that. Would take 30 minutes, 40 minutes to each visit. It's just not possible sometimes, but to do it in stages, look, I think it just comes down to who's good at doing it and who's not good at doing it, and if you're not, learn better ways to interact. But I think the majority of the GPs are fantastic at it.
I've got a question here from Tureshni. Hope I pronounced that correctly. Sometimes I get teenagers who do want to engage with me or any support, who do not want to engage with me or any support services. The accompanying parent is also very distraught and helpless. How do I approach that situation? And that's a very common thing with teenagers. Certainly that initial engagement can be very tricky to get them in the door, in the room. And also the common model that is used for engaging with teenagers is to have that structure where you're talking to both parent and teenager together, and then ask permission to then break it up, where you're just talking to the teenager by themselves, and then bring the parent back in. So that it's that evolution to that teenager or young person becoming an adult, that they're becoming independent in terms of the way they interact with the doctor as well. So teenagers can be, of course, very tricky, but in terms of their relationship with you as a doctor and becoming a more independent person. Anybody?
Yeah, I'll just say really common problem and always difficult. And then sometimes it's worth talking with parents, because in a sense the parent there is feeling helpless and demoralized completely. So it's also about asking the parent who else is involved with your kids. Sometimes school counselors are quite important. Will accompany a kid to see you. Look, I have on occasion, I mean, this is in a context of actually having met the kid once or twice, when they don't want to come back, which is also very common. Will you come if you can bring your best friend with you? It's a bit tricky if they're younger, so I'm not so bad if they're 16, 17, a bit more of a problematic approach if they're younger. So you have to, again, pick about maturity, consent, and you don't want to expose friends to unnecessary distress or stress. But you'll often find that teenagers, the vast majority, are very well linked with their peers, and some way of trying to encourage a member of the peer group to come with them is very powerful in getting them there.
I agree with the peer group with our daughter. That was the only way we could get her to get help, was to talk to her peers, talk to them, to have a talk to her, and for them to discuss it together, relating to how important it was for her to seek help.
Yeah, look, we're from Victoria, and down in Victoria they've got a lot of good teenage places they can go to, like Kids Space, and I don't Headspace is what I'm thinking of. There's a couple of mental illness ones too that would deal with kids that have got mental illness in their families, and they were really good because their peer support workers there were fantastic with the kids. My theory with teenage boys is you just lock them away until they're 28 and bring them back home again, but I know that's against the law and you can't do that. A bit tricky sometimes, but yeah. Look.
Yeah, another question here about going back to tantrums. Any resources to read? Now, resources is tricky. I mean, there's about 3 million books been written on parenting, especially young children, and you can see whole bookstores full of books on this sort of topic. Now, some of them are very good, and I think really, I actually more have names of people I respect and know, both Australian and overseas. But there's also lots of really bad advice out there as well that gets back to more that authoritarian model of, they should be controlled and this sort of thing. So maybe I would ask the parent what resources they've already exposed themselves to, because often they have a great deal, and maybe even just doing a bit of a search about whatever they've been reading. Of course, as I mentioned before, Raising Children Network and anything that's, I tend to go with where the resource is based. Is it based in a children's hospital, or is it based in a reputable non-government organisation, or that's a not-for-profit organisation? Because there is lots of really very poor books that give very poor advice on parenting, coming from whatever angle that is going to design to sell their book. What's your guys? What are your experiences on parenting advice sources?
Well, we've done just about every parenting course you could possibly do. We had one child with a disability, 2 with ADHD, and 1 with mental issues. So we did go to parenting courses. A lot of them were run by mental health facilities. Some of them were run by Parent Zone in Victoria. We found them very helpful, if for no other reason, just to give us some confidence that what we were doing was right, and that we weren't the only people in the world whose children were behaving the same as that and had oppositional defiance disorder and throwing tantrums and that sort of thing. So we found parenting courses very, very useful.
Yeah. Look, the best advice that we were given, probably all of them, was 1, unconditional love towards your children, and secondly, you're doing a good job, because parenting is not an easy job, and if you're taking the time out to try and learn whatever you can, you're doing the right thing yourself, and don't shoot yourself in the foot because you you're trying as hard as you can possibly do, but unconditional love towards your kids, that's the best medicine.
I can't agree with that more strongly. I do think the parenting courses do tend to be more consistent and more overt. Books are much less consistent. But I agree. It's more about showing. But just getting back to that tantrums, what you're saying before about does the parent understand what is normal, and that tantrums are normal in 2-year-olds. You know, the majority of parents of 2-year-olds think that their child has a problem with their behaviour, which is a startling statement, really, to be able to make.
Yeah.
And that's the majority, and more than 50%. And so, normalising what is normal 2-3-year-old behaviour, and if it is normal, of course, you've got to explore that. But yeah, certainly. But in terms of resources, yeah, I suppose you just got to sort of try and have a bunch in your head. I did put up that slide. We'll try and send that out to people before about some of the ones I use. But I think certainly Raising Children Network, they're commonly used parenting courses like, a positive parenting program, etc. are a good starting point.
Yeah, I know one of our boys went through the terrible twos for about 8 years, and we started to realise then it was probably a bit of a problem, but generally the 2 or 3 years is about the limit, isn't it?
Yeah, and the other important thing I think the student Anna reminded me of is how important being with a group of parents is, because there's a lot of swapping of stories, and the experience of your kid might be normal or this can be managed, comes from living with other parents or hearing from them who do it. That's the other half of parenting programs. Well-functioning parents can use behavioural things well. Parents who feel they're struggling or they're really demoralised need a bit of their own resource and coping kind of bucket filled up, and they get that best from being or doing parenting programs with other parents.
And sometimes not even just doing those courses, just having that interaction with other parents.
Yeah.
We went away with some parents on the weekend with kids with disabilities, and one of them's having issues with being bullied, and she's feeling suicidal and just really in a horrible place. And just being around others that just comforted them and talked them through it. And we've been through that ourselves, so we had a bit of experience on that. And they all went away with more knowledge just by the fact that they weren't talking to professionals, but they were talking to people who knew what they were talking about, just having that comfort and knowing that they were doing the right thing as parents and just giving them support. And I think sometimes that works just as well.
A good segue there is another important question, I think. Can you point me to resources for controlled crying? I've been approached by many parents who felt uncomfortable in trying this method. Most were worried about long-term adverse mental outcomes in the future. Now, controlled crying really has gone out of fashion, or out of favour, I should say, in the sleep and settling world. The usual approach, there's a variety of terms that are used, but responsive settling is more the approach that is used these days. And if you want to know more about that sort of stuff, once again, I know it's all there on Raising Children Network, because I've looked at it many times. And there are some other techniques, but controlled crying really is not something that's looked upon favourably by basically nearly all people in that sector. It does work in the right child and the right parent, but if you're applying it to a parent that is struggling already, or who doesn't have the emotional capacity to do it properly, or if or a parent is applying it to the sort of infant who is much more difficult to get to sleep, it often doesn't work and just stresses everybody out. There are some suggestion that controlled crying actually does cause harm in some people. I'm not sure if there's any evidence base for that. Nick, are you aware of anything in that direction?
No, not really.
No. But anyway, it certainly is not looked upon favourably. There's someone else here who's written, can you explain unconditional positive regard? Is it a way to tackle tantrums? I think you're referring there to unconditional love that was mentioned before. Basically, which is where you would support that child without a but at the end of the sentence. You know, it's I love you without a but. So I love you, but I wish you tidy up your room. It's just I love you. I back you regardless of what you do, and I'll need to guide you at times, but I always back you. And so getting that across to the child will make you as a parent what's been referred to as a charismatic adult, an adult that inspires a child to believe in themselves. And everyone needs a charismatic adult, preferably more than one. And if that charismatic adult, whether it's a football coach or a teacher or a parent or whoever, that will help that child develop resilience. So that unconditional love is what we want.
Yeah, but just two things to say about that. As a parent, you inevitably are required to be bigger, stronger, kinder, and wiser. So it's not just a blanket of love. It also has to be responsible and have some limits. And we often say, in the way that James is talking about it, some adult who absolutely delights in you is the sort of critical ingredient around positive regard.
If anybody has got any other questions, please feel free to put them up on the question board there. I think we are going to try and get today's slides and reading resources to people, but I'll see what we can organise with the college and emerging minds people. But I think we've just about run out of stuff to talk about. Unless, Nick, you got anything else to say?
Just quickly, that one about the tantrums that someone was asking about. Tantrums is the context where the parent has to remember they are bigger, stronger, kinder, and wiser. So sort of, blanket positive regard isn't enough. It's really critical about parents keeping their kids safe, setting some limits, setting some boundaries, and some of the things that you were touching on about tantrums really can terribly distress parents, demoralize them terribly. So it's also about refueling parents to kind of manage tantrums, sometimes about normalizing them, but also about techniques to limit them and their impact on kids. Kids often feel very distressed when they had tantrums. They feel like they've been out of control. They feel very vulnerable. They feel very distressed. That's the time when they need the positive regard, in a sense, after a tantrum.
Yeah, they're bruised. They're bruised.
Yeah, so it's all. Some of these things are all about the timing and when in the stage of a tantrum. And the other thing that's important in staging, I think, is, and Anna Stewart might have comment on this. There's a staging about recovering your parenting confidence and competence. I think you talked about how vulnerable you are sometimes when you come in to see a GP, and how you kind of re-establish your being sort of remoralized, and then how the difference that makes to setting these tasks about getting back in the position about being stronger, wiser, kinder for your kids.
Absolutely. Look, yeah, couldn't agree with you more. That's. I think I stated on earlier on, being a parent's not easy, and look, I would say majority of the audience out there are parents as well, and you all know that, and we all go through stuff ourselves that make our lives harder, and if it makes our lives harder, it makes those around us harder. So I think just sort of even just having that knowledge that they're struggling as well as human beings, they're going to be struggling as parents as well, and I think sometimes just that reassurance from somebody, from anybody, just to say you're doing a good job. Even just the fact that you're here today is testimony to the fact that you're really making an effort.
Just building your resilience as a parent. That's really important.
I suppose one last question we might just cover with the 3 minutes we've got left. Any general pearls of wisdom regarding dealing with kids pulled in different directions from parents locked in custody battle and separation? Now, that's a really good question, because it's a common situation that if you deal with kids a lot, that this is really... First thing I would like to say as a GP is write down who's in the room in your notes, okay? From a medical legal point of view, here with Kim, mum, and Andy, dad, or Andy, boyfriend of mum, or whoever it is, just write it down in the notes. Be very careful what you write. Alleged and all these sort of things. So I think note-taking is very important. But in terms of the way you're interacting with the family, often if you're dealing with one parent who's giving you their side of things, and it usually, to my experience, sounds very convincing, and then you deal with the other parent and they sound very convincing. So realise that you are only hearing one version of events, and but also realise that the person who is in front of you needs help. So you're not taking sides so much. You're just saying, I'm going to try and help you do what you're trying to do. Now, if it's a 50-50 split, 50% of the time in charge of a child is actually a very big influence in that child. So, even though they can't control what's on the other side, So it is a very difficult situation, but it's not a this can't be fixed situation. It's you can still have a really important positive influence on a child, even if you are only if you're around 50% of the time. Nick, have you got any comments? You do see a lot of this, I'm sure.
Yeah. The thing you're struggling with is, are the parents so preoccupied with their battle with the other parent that they're not keeping their kid front of mind? So I was like, kids can cope with that for the short term, not so good about long term, and they will protest and they'll have symptoms and all those sorts of things. And then I think that discussion about what are the resources, alternative kind of parents, uncles, aunts, that the kids can get access to while the parents are going through a terrible, distressing, thing that's going to last a while. And then trying to move a discussion about if you could put your kid front of mind at the moment, and I know there are good reasons why you can't, what do you think they need most? So you can come back to some of these questions that we saw the GP asking Billy, and they are about the parenting, also the parent also having some control about which kind of, access to whom, for when, and then trying to get to the point about, well, the kid does have two parents. How can we establish some routines that don't harm the kid and allow them to get access to both parents? It's always difficult. It's always fraught. It's tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And those protective factors you're mentioning, they're really, really important. Okay, we might wind it up there because it is 8:30. I'll just hand over back to our college representative.
Hi everybody, thank you for your participation this evening. This is a few of the upcoming webinars if you'd like to register, also on our website as well. So there'll be an evaluation at the end if you'd like to complete it. Thank you for joining this evening.